All right, so I'm going to take all my data here, and notice I clicked on the little box that's left of the A and on top of the 1, and that's basically a select all button. I can also, if I'm clicking anywhere on the screen, I can hit Control A, and that would also be a select all. And the reason why I want to do that is after I select all, I kind of want to double click on the little line between column A and column B, because what happens is if I have the entire Excel file selected and I double click on any of the rows or any of the columns, what this is going to do is this is going to auto resize. Again, let me just go back for a second, and I'm going to double click again. So I'm going to go ahead and double click, and that is going to expand. So once you expand, you're able to see each specific separate column. And what is the purpose of having each column expanded is that I don't have to be manually expanding left and right, so I can see every single piece of content from it. So if there happens to be a lot of content, obviously this is going to be hard to manage. But since this is still within my screen size, I'm totally okay. Now, what I want to do is, and it's kind of going to be the focus is this. I'm going to separate the data from this column from the post date, and I'm also going to separate data from the description date. I'm also going to split up debits and credits based on whether they're positive or negative. So there'll be a lot of sort of cleanup and preparation at this stage. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a column, and I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the contents of this description. Normally what I do, if I'm going to modify the original source of anything, I duplicate it first, and I duplicate it as values. Why? Because maybe if I screw up and along the way I hit a button by mistake, or I want to see what the original text was before I cleaned it, I have it there. But on this one, I can just make this column really small, so that's just there for peace of mind to let me know that the original text was there. So under this column that I'm going to modify, I'm going to call it cleaned up data. I'm going to call it cleaned up data. And then under this column, just to kind of be consistent here, I'm going to call this original data. Perfect. And I'm going to go ahead and make this really small, or I can just right click and hide. That will work just as well. So the next step I'm going to do, now I got that data duplicated, I'm also going to insert a new column next to the date, and I'm going to insert one more. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have Excel reinterpret this date as text. So I'm going to call this year, and the next column I'm going to call it month. So what I want to do is I want Excel to extrapolate the year from this date. So the way I do this, I click on equals, and then I put year, and then I basically select what they call the serial number, which is hopefully how Excel detects that as a date field. So as long as it's a date field, it will detect it. Let's just double check to see if it'll do it, and yes, it did. Now the problem is that this is formatted as date, so I just have to reformat this as just regular formatting. So change this to general formatting, and it will change it to the interpretation of that year. So again, what was the formula? I typed equals year. So again, that was equals year. And then I went ahead and selected the field that had the date, close the parentheses, and press enter. And I made sure that this one is not formatted as date. This one has to be formatted as general. Okay, really, really important. And the next thing, I'm going to do the same thing, and then you can pretty much know where I'm going with this. I'm going to hit month, right? So that's the formula, equals month, select the date, and close it. And trust me, this is going to be really important for pivot table. Okay, now this represents the month is being represented in a number, which is kind of the challenge. So whenever the date's represented in a number, I may want to keep it as a number. That's possible, or I may want to convert it to a text. So I want to show you with another column how we convert that to a text. So the way I would do that, it would be, and I'm going to call this month text, and the other one I'm going to call it month number. And trust me, when I'm doing pivot tables or importing data, this stuff comes in really handy. So let's do a month text, and I'm going to hit equal. But this time around, I'm going to type the word text. So it's not going to be the word month. It's going to be the word text. I'm going to open the parentheses, select the value, and then I'm going to say, how do I want to format this text? So I'm going to put, and this is kind of the tricky part, you kind of have to know this, I'm going to put quotes. and then I'm going to put MMM quote. So I do quote MMM quote, press enter, and it will literally type the word Jan. Now, if I put word MMMM, 4 letters, it spells out the word January. If I put quote MM, just 2 M's, I get the 01, and then if I get quote just 1M, I get the 1, which is the same result as month. That's kind of an interesting thing. So I'm going to put the 4 M's because I want to spell out the entire year. So I'm going to select all this content. I'm going to double click on the bottom right corner of what I selected, double click on that area, and this is going to repeat all the way down. And notice I have quite a few transactions here. I have about 250 transactions, so that actually brought in all the data like that. And again, this is really, really important when importing data, when creating reports, that sort of thing. All right, good. So now I got my clean type. I got my post date. I can actually hide my post date because I'm not going to be working with dates anymore. I'm going to sort of just going to be focused on the month. I don't want to see the numbers. So I'm just going to close that as well and click on hide. So then I'm just looking at year and month, and you start seeing, how what type of stuff I can be doing with this information. Now let's do something else. Let's go ahead and separate the debits and credits. Okay, so I can do this multiple approaches. There's actually more than one way to achieve this. Now I'm going to make the font even bigger just because I'm about to get into a little bit deeper, hairier formula, which is dealing with if. So I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. So I have here 2 columns next to amount. I have 2 blank columns, and I'm going to separate debits and credits here. So let me start here with debit and then go to credit. And normally in accounting or finance, we put debit on the left and credit on the right. That's just kind of how we do it. So I'm going to say equals. And then there's 2 ways to do this. I'm going to show you both ways. I'm going to say if this column equals to quote credit. So if this equals credit, comma, give me the positive version of this. So I actually don't even have to put any formulas to this because this number is always positive. So then I just press enter, and then I can double click on the pull handle, click down, and then it's going to fill all the ones that didn't find as false, and that really doesn't work really well for me. So I have to change the formula and give it what's called the false result. So instead of saying it return a false, I'm going to put comma, and I'm going to put quote quote. Basically, I'm saying return me a blank space. Close the parentheses, press enter, and then click, drag it down, and that's going to only take the items that say credit and copy them here. Now I can do the same thing, the formula on this side. And by the way, this was the debit column, so obviously I made a mistake here. So let me just change this to debit. Okay, and click and drag that again. And then, however, because the debit, I don't want it to be as a negative, then I would have to change that formula a little bit. So the way I would change that formula is I would say, hey, give me the negative version of it. So convert it from negative to positive. You can also, instead of doing give me the negative version of it, I can say give me the absolute value version of it, which is always going to be a positive number. So I can say instead of returning H5, give me the absolute value of H5. So that's an ABS formula. Or I can do the negative version of it, which will give me the same result. So by doing that, that is going to go ahead and convert that into a positive number. So it will work the same way on the credit side, where I would do equals if this type is the same thing, and I can even use the heading to do so. So if I can say this type is the same thing as my heading, which actually contains words that match, then return the absolute value, which is ABS, right, of my amount, close parentheses, comma, and then obviously the result of that is going to be quote, quote, which is basically going to give me blank information. So I press enter, and that's going to return that. Now, before I click and drag, this is going to be an issue because when I click and drag, notice that if I pull up this formula, this is targeting that column or that cell immediately above from it because we didn't lock it. We were supposed to lock this in. So what we're supposed to do is something called an absolute reference. Okay. So what I want to do is when I click and drag this and duplicate this formula down, I want this formula that's asking for this credit, which is J1, to be stuck there. I don't want it to be able to move down as I click and drag that formula down. So in order to do that, I'm going to add some dollar signs to the left of the J and the left of the 1. And I know that's it feels kind of a strange thing. And there's a keyboard shortcut for that. That's F4. So if you press F4 on your keyboard on a PC, this is going to automatically add those dollar signs to it. But what those dollar signs do is that they lock in the formula. So when I double click on that pull handle to then have that formula duplicate down, anytime that I click on that formula, you see that it's always recalling that J1. So that's actually a really important component of it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and clear this whole thing because I'm going to use what is obviously a much easier approach. So I'm going to go ahead and just clear all these contents here. And because if I look at the amounts and I see that there's pretty much positives and negatives already because I'm lucky that my bank downloads it that way. And then you may want to be careful because some banks will bring in all the data in absolute numbers, and you would have to convert them based on the type. In this case, the bank is bringing positives and negatives the right way. So the way I do an if formula, I just use a much easier, which I say equals, and then I say if this number is less than 0, which in this case would be a debit, right? Or a credit in this case, whatever, depending on the context, right? If we're talking about a bank or a credit card, debits and credits may be mixed in together. So in this case, let's just say that for this particular case, credits are positives and debits are negatives, which in accounting is kind of the opposite. But let's just say that's the case. I'm going to say equals. If the number is less than 0, so it's just very easy. If this number is less than 0, then go ahead and give me the absolute value of that number. And again, absolute value is a positive number no matter what. So give me the positive version if it's positive, or give it to me positive if it's positive. So I'm going to say if it's less than 0, give me the absolute value of that number. And then the false result is that last comma, quote, quote. That way it brings in a blank. So I'll press enter. And let me see, did I miss something in the formula? Oh, of course, I was supposed to put if. so if that H2 is less than 0, give me the absolute value. Otherwise, give me a blank. So I'll press enter. Then click and drag. And then you see that comes up. And then what I can do is I can just take that same formula. I'm going to copy it. So I'm just going to select it, copy it. And then I'm going to come into the next cell on the credit, and then I'm going to go ahead and just paste it back in there. But all I have to do is, in terms of formula writing, and let me expand this here so you can see better. So I'm going to say, well, instead of telling me if it's less than, I'm just going to say if it's more than. So if it's more than 0, then give me the absolute value. Otherwise, give me a blank. So I press enter, and then I click and drag, and then I perfectly have cleaned up debits and credits, or converted debits and credits when the bank brought it to me in this negative and positive approach. Okay, so again, don't pay too much attention on which is the debit and which is the credit, again, because some banks, the bank's version of debit and credit is different than the accounting version of debit and credit. So like, don't think about debits and credits. Just think about left side or right side, right? Expenditure or payment or deposit, whatever it happens to be. So we're doing good so far. So the next thing I want to do is I want to now clean up the data. So I'm going to show you a couple of techniques, and obviously there's 250 transactions here, so that could take a little long. But I'm going to show you a couple of techniques to clean up data when it comes in these really bad patterns. The first thing I do is I cut it. So I know that more or less the first 30 characters or so, it's good stuff, and the rest is just pure garbage. So remember, I still created that one column that contains the original data. So if I lose it, I can always refer that original column. So what I'm going to do is I'm only going to recall the first 30 characters. And again, that's just me saying a number. It could be any number really. So I'm going to hit equals left, open parentheses, and say, I want the left of, in this case, G2, but I only want the first 30 characters. So I'm going to put left G2, comma 30. If you want 40, 50 characters, obviously you just change that number. So then I press enter, and then I'm going to show you that basically is going to cut off at that B. And obviously that's still not fully cleaned up, but it's there. So I'm going to click and drag that down, and then we'll see I get a little bit of a cleanup of the data. It's not perfect yet, but we're getting there. Okay. So what I can do is I'm gonna let this formula be. So I'm not gonna copy and paste values yet. And then I'm going to look for patterns. So I'm going to look for patterns here on the G side to say, hey, what patterns kind of repeat themselves? Well, one of the patterns that repeats itself is a lot of these transactions have dates in them. Yeah, so I'm definitely want to get rid of anything that has a date in it. Now, I don't know of a way that I can tell Excel, get rid of dates. But what I can do is I can say, hey, if the information looks like this, get rid of it. So let's look for patterns. What do we have here? Well, we have a space, we have two numbers, we have a slash, two numbers, and a space. So I can use a find and replace to just get rid of dates real quick. So I'm gonna hit the entire column, hit Control F on the keyboard, which will open my find and replace. And then I'm gonna click on replace. And then I'm gonna say, okay, what am I looking for? So I'm looking for question mark, slash question mark question mark. Now it's hard to see here just because everything's really small, but I'm going to go ahead and just make sure that I add a space at the beginning, a space at the end to just make sure that we don't grab maybe some vendor's name that had a slash somewhere in the middle. So that's the pattern that we're looking for. And what are we going to replace it with? Nothing. We're going to basically get rid of it. So I'm going to click here where it says replace all, and that is going to get rid of all of my dates. Okay. Now in some cases, for example, it didn't get rid of this one. So let me go ahead and try this one again. So I'm going to hit Control F, and I'm going to replace question mark, slash question mark, replace with nothing, replace all. That finished getting rid of the last couple of ones. Now, there's a couple of other patterns here. Like, for example, notice that there's all these extra numbers, and then the letters CCD, and then ID, and then column, and then all this stuff, but it looks like it's repeating itself over and over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that entire string. Notice I grab the entire string, hit copy, select the entire column, Control F, replace, find the entire screen, right? The entire string, and replace with nothing, replace all. You got rid of 82 replacements. And it's not perfect, but you're going to go little by little and start cleaning that up. And what's nice is as you go into my column that only has the first 30 characters, you're going to have much more cleaner data. So let's say, for example, we stop there. Okay, that's as much as we're going to do. So we're going to select the column F, copy it, and then we're going to paste on top of it, but we're going to do something called paste special. And we're going to paste special values. So we're going to paste special values. And by the way, that has a shortcut. That's Control Alt V. So Control Alt V is the equivalent of right click, paste special values. So let me do it again. Copy it, right click, paste special values, which you can access by hitting Control Alt V. It will open paste special. And then you go values, okay, and that basically gets rid of the formulation, and it just brings in the raw data in there. Now, the new thing I want to do is I'm going to open one more column because I'm going to clean this up kind of in steps. I'm going to hit equals, and I'm going to do trim. So I'm going to do trim, and what trim does, it gets rid of all extra spaces. So leading spaces, double spaces, extra spaces, gets rid of all that stuff. So when I just do a trim, and then I'm going to just show you what that looks like, and then click and select down. That's going to get rid of anything that's, again, leading spaces, double spaces, or extra spaces. So that gets me one more layer of cleanup. Then I'm going to take that same thing. I'm going to copy that column and paste special, and then I went one more layer. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of columns G and H, which basically had the duplicate. Remember, I still have that original data in there if I ever want to recall it. So I'm basically narrowed down to, let's say, a much leaner version of that data. The next thing I want to do is, and let me just call this it called it cleaned up data. I'm going to select this entire data field by hitting Control A, and that selects the entire column that has data. And then I'm going to hit Control Shift L, which is the same thing as clicking as in data filters, is the same effect. So data filters, Control Shift L will basically enable, again, Control Shift L will enable filters. And what that will do is allow me to do a couple things. One, it allows me to do something called auto sorting, where basically I can just sort by like this, sort Z through A, sort A through Z, and that helps because then after I sort, I can look for patterns. So for example, you see that two American Express ACH payments have one character difference. Look at that, 2 and 7. I have to clean that up. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the last two characters, and then I'm just going to click and drag that down and replace it. And it's very important for importing data or for pivoting. It's really important to have consistency. Otherwise, it will look like two different types of transactions. Let's see where other one it's a good opportunity to do so. Let's see. Most of these are now much better cleaned up, and I don't have a lot of repetitive things here. So this is perfect. Actually, look at this online payment with a bunch of numbers. Maybe I don't need this bunch of numbers. I'm just going to put online payment and that's it because all these numbers really don't mean anything. And I'm going to click and drag that down, and that gives me the next set of pattern. And as I go down, basically, I'm just looking for things that are essentially the same vendor. Like this is perfect. See, same vendor, but it just has an extra character there that is going to cause an issue when I import or pivot. So I'm also going to click and drag the one on top of it. That way it becomes a pattern. And that pretty much, that was one set of cleanup. And it really helped to do all those steps before. So then after the data is cleaned up, I'm going to go ahead and hit Control A again. So I select my data field that has information in it. And then I'm going to go into the Insert tab and then click Pivot Table. Insert Pivot Table. So I'm going to go ahead and click Insert Pivot Table. And again, Pivot Table, if the data is good enough to go on a pivot table, the data is good enough to be imported. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And that's going to go ahead and open my pivot table field, which, by the way, is actually a pretty simple functionality. A lot of people get intimidated by it. They think it's some sort of advanced function. It actually is not. A pivot table is a very, very easy function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put type here under filters, and you're going to see what I mean by that. That way I can basically choose whether I want to see checks, debits, or whatever, right? And then I'm going to grab my year, and then I'm going to put it under rows. Again, I grab year on the rows, and then I'm going to do month text, put that under year. That way it's organized in that year month fashion. And then I'm going to take my cleaned up data, and I'll make that my next dimension. So I'm going to put that right under month, right? So I'm going to see it by month and then by vendor. And then I'm going to go to debit, and I'm going to bring debit, bringing up to values, and then I'm going to take credit and drag that up to values. So I'm going to see both my debits and credits, and by default in pivot tables, it's going to do a count. So this is just counting total number of transactions, and that could be useful in some cases. I want to know how many, but in this case, most of the times we talk about numbers, right? So we're going to do value field settings, and we're going to change that to sum, and hit OK. And the same thing for the credits. Hit the drop down there, click value field settings and sum. And that's going to give me a summary of every single vendor by month. And then if I want to say, look, I only want to see my deposit slip. So I click there, it says deposit slip, and hit OK. That's going to narrow it down to only the transactions that are that category. Or if I want to go to credit and I hit OK, then it shows me only my credits. Or I hit the drop down, I hit debit, and I hit OK, that only shows me my debit. So it's a really, really powerful thing to clean up the data before we do any sort of reporting. That way, this stuff has a logical organization once we do the reporting. So we talked about cleaning up the data before you import or before you report. And I don't want to talk too much about QuickBooks because this is Excel Power Hour, all about Excel. But if I was using QuickBooks to import the data, Then if I have a clean set of data, not the report, but clean set of data like this, it makes the process of copy and pasting into QuickBooks Enterprise or QuickBooks Accountant really, really easy. And there's several videos on my YouTube channel that talk about the process of importing, so I don't want to talk too much about that. I kind of want the focus to be around building the report in Excel, because again, if the data is good enough to build a report in Excel, the data is going to be good enough to import.